The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, on February 21st, there was a stirring and moving meeting of the Halifax Regional School Board, a meeting at which the lion's share of the agenda was taken up with board members' analyses, criticisms, reflections on the Glaze recommendations, and in particular, the recommendation that elected Democratic local voice school boards in Nova Scotia should be obliterated and eliminated from the landscape of democracy in Nova Scotia altogether. One after another, members of the board spoke with, I thought, moving clarity, with deeply thought-through senses of principle, with eloquence, and with analytic force. The thought from that meeting, the words from the meeting that stayed with me the most of all the things that were said, or one of the thoughts certainly that stayed with me, is something that was spoken by Susie Hanson, the member for District 5, Peninsula North Fairview. Henson made a number of observations, and then she, as the last speaker, she set out a number of considerations. But after her observations and analysis and considerations, she concluded with one very clear, strikingly understated truth. She said in conclusion simply this: I don't think this is the right thing to do. And certainly this is the case, Mr. Speaker, that what is being proposed, the obliteration of locally elected voices in the way that we constitute our educational democracy in Nova Scotia, it is certainly the case that this is absolutely, at its core, not the right thing to do. It is simply not the right thing to do to take the same super-centralized approach that the Liberal government has taken to health care since coming to power 4 1/3 years ago. It's not the right thing to take that hyper-centralized approach to health care and apply it now to the education of the children of the province. Let's take a short step back and think about where this command and control hyper-centralization ideology comes from and what our experience has been with it since the Liberals came to power in Nova Scotia. Following the 2013 election, the Liberal government set out on their priority mission to replace the then district health authorities with one super-centralized, Halifax-based Nova Scotia Health Authority. The people of the province were told that this move from local voices to a centralized authority would yield benefits in terms of streamlining and efficiency. More importantly, the people of the province were told that the move to super-centralization would yield benefits in terms of patient care. But then, from then until 2015, with the NSHA's inauguration, all the expertise, all the energy, all the policy focus in healthcare in Nova Scotia was applied not to the question of emergency rooms, not to the question of ambulance availability, not to the question of expanding nursing home facilities, not to the question of seeing that there's primary care for every person in the province. All of the focus, all of the attention was brought to bear on the singular matter of the accomplishment of the closing of the district health authorities and their replacement with one super-centralized Nova Scotia Health Authority. And today, in 2018, we are living with the consequences of the terrible misprioritization that this involved. We live today in a province where we do have over 100,000 people without access to primary care. We live in a situation where emergency room closures have become so epidemic, now spreading from Shelburne, Lunenburg, Parsborough, Spring Hill, New Waterford, Glace Bay, the north side, so that the situation of emergency room closures is analogous to where it stood about 10 years ago, prior to the investigation of this and a new approach being taken with the John Ross report. We're in a situation, as we heard earlier in question period today, where code census has become our hospital system's middle name, owing to how our hospitals have become so overfilled with people who are not residents at all, are not patients at all of hospitals, but are rather residents waiting for placement in nursing home care. But we know that we have patients being cared for in emergency rooms, in hallways, in all kinds of places where their care is not optimum, because there are no places for them in the hospital, because no new investments have been made in opening any nursing home beds across the province. So all of these problems have become so common after only 2 years of the super-centralized health authority, which was supposed to give us such advances. Particularly since the beginning of the Liberals' second mandate, this crisis in the healthcare system has become so much an unremitting theme of media reporting across the province that we're in a situation now where it's practically the case that the only people who will express the view that healthcare is improved since the centralization of the health authority are either Liberals or those constrained by them in some way to say so. Now, at the core of this startling failure in public policy, which we have experienced with the hyper-centralization of the Nova Scotia Health Authority as it has paralleled the emerging crisis in healthcare around the province, at the core of this startling failure of public policy is the essential flaw, the essential fallacy, the comprehensive failing of the hyper-centralizing approach, namely, the failure which is at the root of this approach to understand that competent governance, capable administration in Nova Scotia is never and can never be governance or administration based on the exclusion of local voices. My mind runs back to one of the most compelling protest meetings around public policy that I have ever attended, and I have attended a good many of them over the years. The most compelling of them all, however, was the one I attended last May, the doctors' protest which was held in Sydney Mines. Now, at that meeting, the program was that the full high school hall was to be addressed and was addressed by a series of local physicians. Doctor after doctor took the stage and described the healthcare crisis in their area as it appeared from their particular experience within their own practice. And then they spoke about all the unsuccessful efforts that they'd been involved in to try to redress these problems. Unsuccessful efforts because doctor after doctor would then list how, when they had made a call to the centralized health authority, no answer had come back, or they would outline how, when they had sent an email about an issue and something that was required, no email came in response, and physician after physician after physician spoke about how the challenges for them of being able to deliver effective care had become so exacerbated because the fundamental governments, the fundamental decision-making authority had been removed to a place removed from their situation and was entirely centralized now in Halifax. One particular grievous example of this I think we've seen in recent months were the revelations brought forward a couple of months ago by a group of psychiatrists in industrial Cape Breton, They spoke about how they had developed a means for dealing with the psychiatrist shortage in industrial Cape Breton, and they had developed this plan, then submitted it to the health authority. But that, in fact, the problem of the psychiatrist shortage had moved from being a problem to becoming a debacle, because their proposal was never, ever responded to. As a matter of fact, their proposal was never even acknowledged for 18 months by the centralized health authority in Halifax. I think of a family doctor in Pictou County who once spoke to about what it's like now to work under the Central Health Authority as opposed to the old Pictou County District Health Authority. And he said about it very simply, he said it's simply that we no longer have anyone here who understands our local circumstances, who it's possible for us to call. Now, Susie Hansen, in my judgment, is therefore absolutely right. To abolish local voices, elected local voices, in the determining of the education system in Nova Scotia is not the right thing to do. And to take this very command and control, super centralized approach that we have seen undermine so much of our healthcare system and undermine so much of patient care in Nova Scotia, to take this hyper-centralized command and control approach and apply it now to the education of the children of the province is a profound and major mistake. It's utterly the wrong thing to do to eliminate school boards and replace them with a hyper-centralized bureaucracy, because in Nova Scotia, so very, very much depends on the clarity and the priority that is provided on the subject of public policy by local voices. There are, in fact, before us in Nova Scotia two great and opposing pictures of our province and of the road forward. The first of these opposing pictures, which is the one which was used to guide the formation of the centralized Nova Scotia Health Authority, and is the picture which guides the formation of the Glaze recommendations, and is the picture which is deep in the ideology of the present Liberal command and control, hyper-centralizing administration. The first of these pictures before us is an approach that could be called the city-state of Halifax. Now, for the vision of the city-state of Halifax, Nova Scotia is Halifax, and everything else is small potatoes for this vision. Everything else is a nuisance, an afterthought, something to be paved over and painted green if you happen to get some time later on. That's the first vision, which we've seen in operation in our healthcare, and which we are in the process of seeing operationalized now in our education, the city-state of Halifax. The other, the second vision, is entirely different. That is the vision of the Nova Scotia of 18 counties. 18 counties and many, many regions, as diverse and distinct as distinct and diverse can be. The total tapestry of which makes up the wonder of a province where within an hour's drive, virtually anywhere, without crossing a single border, one certainly can and does change worlds. Now, in this second vision of Nova Scotia, which I will call the local voices vision, in the local voices vision of Nova Scotia, local voices are paramount because they're understood to be what bring to the fore the local circumstances, the local strengths, the local challenges which comprise the distinctness of the local situation. It's in this second vision, the local voices vision, which is really at the heart of the outlook towards our province and our people, which is in the lives and in the culture and in the selves of the majority of the people of our province. But although our people look at our province in a local voices vision, It is unfortunately the case that the city-state of Halifax vision is the one which dominates at the moment, so that the people of the province are confronting a government so obsessed with command and control centralization, as the government is obsessed with balanced budgets, and which therefore, a government which is therefore in the midst, of imposing the city-state of Halifax vision on the entirety of the province. Now, there's a great deal that has been written about this in the past few weeks. One thing I thought was particularly telling was a piece written by public affairs commentator in Sydney, Tomer Baniak, who recently wrote this very simple sentence. The province's planned further centralization of the education system will fail just like the centralized health authority. Tomer Baniak is right. The replacement of local elected voices with centralized appointed bureaucrats will not work. It will not work because it cannot work. And it cannot work because Nova Scotia cannot be constructively governed as though it were all the same, because it is not the same at all. Let me say what is obvious to those who believe in the Nova Scotia of local voices, but what is unfathomable to the ideologues of the city-state of Halifax, namely this. What works on the South Shore will not work in Cumberland County because Cumberland County and the South Shore are not the same. What works on the Eastern Shore will not work in the Annapolis Valley because the Annapolis Valley and the Eastern Shore are different. What works in Clare will not work in industrial Cape Breton because industrial Cape Breton is not the municipality of Clare. The city-state of Halifax cannot but lead to incompetence and incoherence because Nova Scotia is not Halifax. And when super-centralization for any reason blocks this truth from view, what you get are not efficiencies or streamlining, but invariably a hyper-central, unconsultative, closed-off, darkened curtain disaster of a liberal mess. It is the wrong thing entirely to do, and I would say particularly, we should emphasize, it is the wrong thing to do from the point of view of the terrible message in civics it gives to the children of our province. I would expect that many MLAs take advantage of their position to get an opportunity to go to classrooms and to speak to kids in our public school system. I certainly would hope that MLAs would take every opportunity to do this, to speak to them about how democracy works and about how our democratic system works in Nova Scotia. What a terrible lesson for the government to give the students of the school to say, in our view as a government, there are some things that have been lacking in the performance of some school boards. There are some concerns about the vitality of the turnout of the population voting for some school boards. We have some issues around the number of school board members that have been that are being acclaimed, and therefore, as your government, students of Nova Scotia, what we propose, what the kind of civics we believe in, the kind of democracy we stand for is, on the basis of these observations, we're going to take elected democracy in schools in Nova Scotia and we're going to wipe it off the map altogether. Of all the absurd approaches to take to the improvement of democratic functioning in a province, it's as though, I mean, do people in a church say, well, let's close the church because the minister didn't preach a very good sermon this Sunday? I hope not. Do we say, well, the ministers, the last couple of ministers have had some problems, so let's burn the building down? No, they don't say that. Do we hear anybody say in the United States today, where there are such profound shortcomings in the person holding the office of the president, do we hear anybody say we should eliminate the presidency altogether? We should get rid of all the institutions associated with the White House? Of course they don't say that. So we don't hear the opposition on either side here say that because we have a myopic, self-satisfied and not competent government in Nova Scotia at the moment, that we should get rid of provincial governments in our province altogether. This is not an approach that has been taken by anybody, because we understand core to democratic functioning. And surely this is what the heart of the lesson that any MLA would want to get across to any school group that they spoke to about how democracy works, that when there are problems in democracy, we fix those problems democratically. And I don't want to allow either the notion that the government has put across to stand that somehow all the experience of school boards in Nova Scotia has been tied up somehow with inadequacies or failures, because we know that this is absolutely not the case. I'll speak just for a moment from my own personal experience. I came towards this work originally in the context of the movement to keep small rural schools open. Now, this was a very sharp moment in that movement in 2005. In 2005, there were a number of schools, particularly in the HRSB, that staff of the school board had slated for closure. And as in the small community where I lived at that time, called Upper Musquodoboit, as people looked at the reasons that were offered by school board staff why our schools should be considered for closure, they found there were all kinds of errors in the calculations. That the calculations based on how many preschool children there were in the community, what the anticipated enrollment would be, that these were wrong. That the calculations about the state of the capital repair of the building and the last time things had been done there to improve it, that these were wrong. And so a group formulated itself in the community, people with no experience in this kind of work, and said, well, how does this work? They say they're going to review our school for closure. But we were able to say the way this works is the bureaucrats in Halifax make a recommendation, but in our democratic system, the decision is made not by those who make this recommendation, but by the elected school board, which every citizen elector has a right to cast a vote for. That board who are responsible to the people that they represent. And so the people of the community gathered themselves together to make the case towards the school board. Now, at the core of this case was that the school board staff had contended that it would not be very difficult for, in that small community, for the students to be bused to the next community 20 kilometers down the road. But what they had failed to calculate is that students did not move from where the school was in Upper Musquodoboit to where the new school was proposed 20 kilometers down the road. In fact, they came on buses on a wide periphery from that school that they were proposing to close down. And so that it meant that the average length of time that it would take for kids to get from the outer end of that periphery to the new proposed school on a bus trip was coming almost close to an hour. And so the parents of the community said, well, how can we make this case to our elected school board? And someone said, well, let's simply show them. They are parents, they are citizens, they are people like ourselves. Surely they'll be able to understand if we show them. And so the school board had a meeting in Upper Musquodoboit, and the parents of Upper Musquodoboit hired a bus and asked the members of the school board if they would come early to the meeting, long enough that they would be able to take a ride on the bus and experience what the morning was like for students in that elementary school. And a number of the members of the school board, in fact, did that. Now, it was a time of year when the roads were pretty rutty. And I don't want you to think that the bus driver avoided all the ruts once the members of the school board were on the board. But the playground supervisor stood in the well of the bus and addressed the school board members and said to them one after one, now, here is the place where such and such a child at 5 to 7 gets on the bus. And then they would go along, and then here's the place where another child at 3 minutes after 7, gets on the bus. And the whole circuitous route was followed through a good many dirt roads, not very many of them, not all of them in real good shape, until it wound its way to the school, at which point one of the members of the school board said that she didn't feel well enough to stay for the rest of the meeting because her stomach wasn't feeling very well after the bus trip that she'd just been on. And so the recommendation was made from the school board, this is a crazy idea, that those kids should have another 20 kilometers added onto their trip. And that particular threat for that community to have their bus trip, their school closed, it was by the democratically elected school board removed. To take that kind of voice, to take that kind of responsibility, to take that kind of accountability out of our system is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Now, I think about some of the words that have been used thoughtfully and wisely in the criticisms of how this is the wrong thing to do. Certainly it has many dimensions that are wrong, democratically, from a civics point of view. But I want to mention in particular about those wrong dimensions, the abolition of those dedicated equity seats on the school boards, the seat for Indigenous representative and the African Nova Scotian representatives. I thought that the report of the Nova Scotia School Boards Association response to the Glaze recommendations used language very thoughtfully. This, the obliteration of the dedicated equity seats is referred to in that report many times, but only ever with one word. Every time the elimination of the African Nova Scotian seats is mentioned in that report, every time the elimination of the dedicated Mi'kmaq seat is mentioned in that board, the word that is used is the word outrage. And why wouldn't the word outrage, the verb outraged, be the word that is used? I think also the public policy commentator Richard Starr in his blog on these issues has used another issue. He calls it reprehensible. These are exact and precise words to use, reprehensible and an outrage. I think about the fact how earlier today in the House, the member for Halifax Needham spoke about the Commission on Effective Representation. That commission, whose recommendations are going to become very much front and centre to the work of this House in the next few weeks, as the whole question of electoral boundaries in Nova Scotia is going to be raised. The dedicated African, Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq seats in are mentioned a great deal in the Commission of Effective Representation. And what is said there is, it is very important, no matter what happens in Nova Scotia democracy, that the principle that is represented in these seats continue to be honoured, because it is one of the most important parts about how democracy is structured in Nova Scotia. This is exactly right, and it is put with exact clarity in the Commission on Effective Representation. Now, I began by speaking about the meeting February 21st, where members of the Halifax Regional School Board addressed their reflections about the proposed closure of school boards in all of Nova Scotia. I want to say that one thing that I heard said there has stuck with me. I have repeated it here in this House. I want to repeat it again now. I was so struck by when it came the turn for Archie Beals to speak at that meeting, that Mr. Beals said something, I think I'm quoting Mr. Beals almost exactly, when he said of the African Nova Scotian seats, we were the last ones to get to the table, and now they're taking away the table. Why wouldn't anybody describe that as reprehensible? Why wouldn't anybody describe that as an outrage? And it is a reprehensible outrage that in this era, when so much democratic energy throughout the Western world is focusing on seeing that there is adequate representation for women in electoral institutions, where in all the electoral institutions we've got in Nova Scotia, we got one where women are adequately represented. Not adequately represented federally, not adequately represented provincially, not adequately represented municipally, but there's one forum where there are 57 women elected in Nova Scotia democracy. That is the school boards of Nova Scotia. And what is the civics lesson to the children of our province that comes from the government on this front? Oh, there's that one front, let's shut it down. No wonder people are outraged. No wonder people find this reprehensible. And I find also reprehensible the response that the Premier has taken when this view is raised, to say, oh, well, we have made this advance on African Nova Scotian representation. He speaks about the bench, about other government offices. We are going to continue to see that people are going to be listened to. There are going to be advisory appointments. But at the core of our electoral system is that an appointment made to an advisor is not to be compared to someone who is elected and accountable to the people for whom they hold that seat. This is at the root of responsible government in Nova Scotia. So there is a tablet here on the wall that speaks about how Joseph Howe in 1847 led the first responsible government anywhere in British North America. And here is his portrait looking down across the government. So what was being said there? At the core of responsible government is that we will not have decisions made that govern our people that are made by advisors. We will have decisions made that govern our people made by those who are accountable to the people themselves. That's what representative government is. That's what responsible government is. That's what democracy is. So to cavalierly, to superficially, with lightness, set that aside and say, oh no, we have some reforms in mind, we have some things that we want to focus on. We'll just take those Mi'kmaq seats and we'll just set that aside for a moment. We'll take those African Nova Scotia seats, we'll take those 57 women, we don't need to hear from them at the moment. We'll set all that over to the side because we're going to seek their advice, is to profoundly misunderstand the character of electoral democracy altogether. And for that reason, as for the other reasons that I have outlined, I want to conclude by saying that Susie Hansen on February 21st had it absolutely right. This is the WRONG wrong thing to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.